Hi, everyone, and welcome to our book talk today. Here we are at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and today we're joined by Shibani Mahtani and Timothy McLaughlin to talk about their book, Among the Braves. Shibani Mahtani is an international investigative correspondent for The Washington Post. She was previously the Post's Hong Kong and Southeast Asia bureau chief and a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal based in Singapore, Yangon, and Chicago. Her Hong Kong coverage was honored with prizes, including a Human Rights Press Award for an investigation into police misconduct. Timothy McLaughlin is a prize-winning contributing writer for The Atlantic. Previously, he worked for Reuters news agency. His work has also appeared in publications including Wired, The Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, and Prospect. He has also won multiple awards for his Hong Kong coverage, including 2 Best in Business awards from the Society for Advancing Business Editing, and is a 2-time finalist for the Livingston Award for International Reporting. As I mentioned, Shibani and Tim are here today to talk about their new book, Among the Braves: Hope, Struggle, and Exile in the Battle for Hong Kong and the Future of Global Democracy, which was just published this week. And this book follows the authors and their own personal experience on the ground, as well as perspectives of activists that participated in Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement that culminated in the 2019 mass protests and subsequent crackdown. So Shibani, Tim, thanks for joining me here today.
Of course, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. And thank you to CSIS as well.
Of course. So you have both been in hot spots around the globe, Yangon, Chicago, and Hong Kong. So what inspired you to write a book about Hong Kong?
Yeah, I mean, I think for both of us, we were covering the day-to-day stuff in 2019, the protests, on the streets on the weekends, and then during the week, kind of the stuff that was going on, smaller protests or online things, just the kind of other stuff that fed the movement. And both of us did a lot of that stuff. Then we did longer pieces, kind of investigations, features on various people, some like graphics-driven stuff. But I still think we felt like there was a lot more to this story. And I think a big part of that was there was a lot of history leading up to 2019 that we weren't covering kind of in the news aspect of how we were writing in that time. So I think we both felt like there was a lot more to it. And I think also we both felt that things had kind of ended very suddenly. COVID happened, the focus on Hong Kong. Well, the national security law came into play, then COVID happened, and things just kind of like the global focus obviously just went elsewhere. And so it was a very kind of abrupt end to something that had been going on for so long. So I think it felt us both feeling like there was more to write about, there was more unfinished stories, there was more to look into. And so I think that's kind of what, and again, it's a bit more of the history to explore and to put it forth, in a way that was accessible to kind of maybe not, academic readers or people who have like a deep history of Hong Kong. I mean, I think they'll enjoy the book, but I think we were also trying to get it out there to the public as well.
Right, so you cover that period of the protest, but you also take it back a little bit. So for our audience that may not know that much about Hong Kong, can you give us just kind of a little bit of an overview that led up to these protests? I mean, anyone who was looking at the newspapers in 2019 or even in 2014 with the umbrella movement was amazed at how many thousands, if not millions of people were in the street. So can you just kind of give us a background after the handover?
Yeah, and I think what we really wanted to sort of research, right, was sort of understanding the origins of Hong Kong's political culture and, its long history of protests. And, as we were kind of looking into it and doing our research and sort of speaking to Rev Chu Tommy Finn, who is the oldest of our 4 characters and the one whose life sort of takes us, through that early history of Hong Kong. Really, we found that 1989 and the crackdown in Tiananmen Square was sort of like the birth of the modern pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. By 1989, Hong Kong's fate had already been sealed. The handover had been negotiated in 1984, the Sino-British Joint Declaration signed. And so, there was already some like trepidation because Hong Kong people weren't involved in the signing of that, the negotiation of that. And so that was sort of foisted upon them, and they were sort of sold it by the British in a big way. And then, the crackdown on Tiananmen Square happened, right? And I think they felt this like total breach of trust and like, how can we now be handed over to a government that does this to its people. And I think they rightly felt that Hong Kong was the place to carry on the legacy of the students at Tiananmen. It was the place to continue pushing for this idea of a more democratic Hong Kong. And really that caused, I think, the first sort of breach in trust between both, right? Beijing saw that Hong Kong was carrying on that legacy of building democracy in China and having democracy as a goal for China. And, you know, obviously the sort of movement that was birthed out of that was like then very suspicious of what could come to them as well. So I think that that was really what centered what then became the modern pro-democracy movement.
So in this book, and you just mentioned Reverend Chu, you tell this story not only through your own experience as journalists and covering these stories, but through the eyes of activists, people that didn't think that they were going to become activists, but then ended up very involved in the movement. But you tell the stories of Reverend Chu, Tommy, Finn, and Gwyneth, and how their work not just impacted them, but their friends and families. And in fact, you have one quote from Finn after participating in his first protest, and he said, quote, "This, he thought, was what it meant to be from Hong Kong." Is this what the other activists thought as well? And what does this mean? And I would also note that you were very careful at the beginning of the book to say, we're not from Hong Kong, we're not Hong Kongers, we're not, you know, we're giving their perspective. And so, and I think that's an important distinction. But that thought of we're Hong Kongers, I think, was threaded throughout the book. So what does that mean, how Finn portrayed that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you mentioned, I'll let Shibani answer the Hong Konger bit, but I think for us, what you mentioned, it was important that we approach this as kind of, you know, still as journalists. There's been a lot of great books that have come out recently about Hong Kong that are more, you know, memoir style, people that are from the city, grew up there. Obviously, our relationship with the city was different. Both of us moved there in 2018 to work, you know, as reporters. And so I think we wanted to kind of keep that through the book and kind of focus on the reporting and kind of center the people from Hong Kong in the story. Yeah, and then on the Hong Kong identity, I think it was something that was very much kind of cemented in 2019. I think it probably kind of started to, I mean, had been forming for a very long time. But, you know, in 2014 and 2019, definitely kind of pivotal moments that I think helped kind of define or crystallize what that meant to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, on the quote specifically, you know, I mean, I think the thing a lot of people forget, because we're in 2023 and the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement seems so sort of finished or crushed. Actually, in 2003, when Beijing first tried to impose a domestic kind of national security law in Hong Kong, there was a protest and it stopped it, right? And then in 2012 through 2014, when there was a push for national education within schools, that was also what led to kind of the rise of Joshua Wong and that group of student activists, and they stopped that too, right? And so obviously things were different in 2014 and 2019, but I think it was so ingrained in the culture of Hong Kong people who, you know, were in the yellow camp, so they, you know, broadly speaking, pro-democracy, that protests do stop things, right? Like you can take to the streets and get the outcome you wanted. I mean, in 2003, the government was totally embarrassed, right? There were people that had to step down. You know, Tung Chee-hwa was sort of, you know, having to kind of step back in a big way from you know, governance, right? And yeah, I think that's sometimes hard to remember in the context that we're in. So for the generation that sort of came to be in 2014 and then again in 2019, I think they had so ingrained in them that, you know, we can actually take to the streets and sort of get the result we wanted because it was so true for so long.
So when you look at this crowd of millions or tens of thousands, depending on the day, was there a typical Hong Kong protester? What was driving them to the streets?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you look at kind of the core on the street, like front of the protest kind of movement, you could define it largely as kind of younger people, you know, in their 20s, probably 30s, and some teenagers as well out there. But then I think if you move back from there, kind of if you think of a protest and then kind of move back in the crowd, there was a huge mix, like a huge swath of the population, right? There was older people who I think a lot of them had felt that they hadn't done enough, you know, earlier on, that they had been too kind of complacent, and a lot of them kind of were almost like apologetic to the younger generation when you would kind of overhear or take part in those conversations. Yeah, and then from there, I think there was in the youthfulness. I think also younger people, there was a tendency by some detractors and kind of Chinese state media to say that it was just like young people who were like economically not in the position they wanted to be in, right? And that also wasn't true. We met tons of people who were involved in this in other ways, donating money, helping kids, drive them away from protests when the police showed up, who were picking kids up in Mercedes Benzes and BMWs, right? I mean, there was a huge swath of not just ages but socioeconomic class as well. There was people who came over from the mainland. They obviously didn't make that well known, but you would meet students who were studying in Hong Kong from the mainland who were taking part or interested to come out and see what was happening. There was at the beginning, certainly when the huge marches were happening, quite a number of expats or people who have permanent residency or kind of adopted Hong Kong as a home. So I think it was incredibly diverse. I think it's very hard to, and I think that's one of the things that made it so kind of interesting and so unique, but very hard to kind of say like this was kind of the typical protester, because on any given day you would meet someone who was different, religious leaders. I mean, it was a huge mix. Yeah.
So interesting. In your book, you mention the famous travel guidebook for any of us who traveled in Southeast Asia, and I especially in the early 2000s, Lonely Planet. I don't know if it even really exists anymore, but it characterized the protests in Hong Kong as more of a festival.
Yeah.
But that changed. And the way that you described the protests in your book, the tear gas that was used, and it was that the way that you could do it, I could practically like taste it and smell. And I recall when I was there as well in 2019 that you could almost still smell it in the air, that in people's apartment buildings, it was seeping into the walls and you could taste it in the food. And you say the tear gas was a physical manifestation of the liberal forces that have been working quietly and methodically to reign in Hong Kong. How did it go from the Lonely Planet Festival with dance and poetry and theatrics to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things that we researched while looking into the book was the writings of the sort of thinkers that have surrounded Xi Jinping in his rise, who really were obsessed with this idea of identity and Hong Kong identity being something they needed to quash and kind of stamp out, right? From even 2003 onwards. I mentioned just now the Article 23, which is the domestic sort of security law that they were trying to pass in Hong Kong at the time. From then, because it collapsed so stunningly, Beijing had sort of seconded a number of people to study that and understand like why Hong Kong was still so anti-China, really, in its outlook and in its sort of mindset, and why with China's rise, Hong Kong hadn't sort of been sold on this idea that being now integrated or part of the mainland was a good thing for them. And I think they found that like Hong Kongers were just sort of growing more confident in their identity and sort of stronger in their sense of themselves. And the writings of Jiang Shigong, who was one of the main sort of thinkers who sort of risen with the rise of Xi Jinping, was that the Beijing needed to learn from the British in trying to like form this sort of new kind of empire where they, sort of essentially kind of recolonize, their former British colonies. And that was like, I think, very, very interesting to us to see how far back this idea of like controlling Hong Kong had even gone, right? And so this was sort of in kind of response to having learned that there was really this like systematic kind of like build up that we saw then explode in 2014 with the umbrella movement. And then at the same time, what was happening with every protest, what was happening after 2014 was a hardening of the police, right? I mean, I think the police in Hong Kong, even though they were Hong Kong people, even though they were like residents of Hong Kong and grew up there, there was a lot of talk at the time that maybe the mainland was sending their own police officers. We never really saw that happening. And we talk about that quite a bit. Yeah. But they really felt this like us against them mentality and attitude that really you see in a lot of American cities too, all over cities all over the world. And this hardening in attitudes, right, sort of really crystallized in 2019, where the top leadership of the police said, it's like it's hands off now. Like we can go, right?
Yeah.
We can fire the tear gas. We can, use the water cannons, which hadn't been used for, many years. We can do anything in our power to stop these protests. What it did, though, was just fuel more anger and resentment on the ground.
Yeah.
So just to back up a little bit on the China angle, it's kind of like a one country, two systems, but with the handover, wasn't there this idea that by 2047, we're going to be one country, one system, but now it seems like that date had gotten moved up.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part is that Deng Xiaoping, coming up with one country, two system, was really focused on Taiwan. Like Hong Kong was sort of a place to test it out, but the ultimate aim and kind of interest was in solving the Taiwan problem or Taiwan crisis, right? And so that I think is interesting now to look out today. Obviously, in 2019, the elections that followed in Taiwan, there's a very firm rejection of that as a workable solution for the situation there. And to that end, I think there's a lot. 2047 is this date that's talked about a lot. It's very unclear, sort of like what comes after, maybe deliberately so. I think that we're seeing now, and one of the things that we talk about is 2047 as an important date now as it was before, or will this integration kind of happen in the years leading up to a way where 2047 comes and there's not much change because the integration has already happened so much. And I think that they were seeing that this big infrastructure push under the current chief executive John Lee to build this like northern metropolis, essentially linking Shenzhen and the outer parts of Hong Kong, right? Like looking to kind of meld these things geographically. Also with the island reclamation project, the bridges, the big bridge that was built previously, the railway system. So I think that part of that, it's very obvious that part of this is kind of all to bring it together. So by the time we get to 2047, I think now it's like kind of a question of what will it look like when we get there, not what happens like immediately after. Because I think there could be very well a very, very high level of integration by then if all these projects do kind of come to fruition.
Sure, definitely. To get back to the violence and this dramatic turn in how the police and how deal with protests and the efficacy of the protests, there was another turning point in the protest movement that you mentioned in your book and dedicated an entire chapter to, which is Yanlong and the date of July 21st. And so from your book, you describe the incident, quote, Yanlong and the date 7/21 would become shorthand for the chilling lengths that Beijing-backed forces would go to terrify the city into submission. What happened here and how did it get so violent and where did this stand out? How did this change the mindset of Hong Kongers?
Yeah, so basically on 7/21, that day was a Sunday, so there was a typical, protests happening in central Hong Kong. That sort of like was the rhythm of the protests at that point, right? Because they started in June, and sort of every Sunday there would be really big demonstrations. So that had sort of like captured the attention of most people, journalists and so on were like all covering that. Most protesters were there, but actually, before that day, there were a lot of warnings being put out in Yanlong, which has traditionally been, a rural community that is a stronghold for triad groups, which are, gangs basically, organized crime. That if protesters or people wearing black or people wearing masks, which were definitive traits of protesters, went to the neighborhood, they would be met with violence, and. True enough, that day there was essentially like a marauding gang of more than 100 men in white shirts, because the white sort of separated them from the protesters in black, who indiscriminately started beating up really whoever, commuters, protesters, average people. And it happened mostly in a subway station, which, were then considered very neutral territory, neutral grounds, right? The goal of any protest sort of policing should be to disperse a crowd. You disperse them into a subway station and they go home, right? And so this really like broke that, sort of rhythm and broke that sort of trust, I think, that people had that their government and also the police would keep them safe, because most crucially, that night, unlike many, many other nights, people were really turning to the police for help, and they were not there. They showed up late. They were very, very light in their sort of touch on the triad members. And yeah, I mean, I think that was a true turning point, right? Where any sort of like reconciliation or any trust institutionally in, you know, the Hong Kong government or the Hong Kong police just totally collapsed.
And I think one kind of complicating factor, or with the situation with the police there, and especially in Yanlong, is that there are still British police officers serving in the Hong Kong police force who joined before 1997. Many of them have obviously retired or aged out of the force. A few of them remain in very high-ranking positions, and some of them, you know, responded to that incident. They became very visible during the protests as a you know, direction of anger. Obviously, it's sort of their presence would run directly counter to China's message that they are, you know, working to kind of decolonize Hong Kong. You know, that rings a little hollow when there's British guys running down the street, you know, chasing after protesters. And so I think that was another factor with the police that it was kind of, again, unique to Hong Kong. You don't see that, you know, there's, you know, I would guess few police forces in the world that have those kind of colonial hangover kind of, and people that are still serving in the force today.
So I think one person who I think personifies, I guess you could say, the villain in the story here is Carrie Lam, who really kicked off the protests in 2019. And you say in your book, you state, quote, "History will judge Lam as a leader who killed her city without needing any soldiers or tanks." Can you tell us a little bit more about what it is that she did that really kicked this off? And I guess, you know, that takes us back. I mean, protests have now been a part and parcel of Hong Kong. But what particularly set this off and set Hong Kong down this road?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it goes back, you know, even before 2019, 2018, there was a terrible murder that took place in Taiwan, where a guy from Hong Kong and his then girlfriend were there on holiday for Valentine's Day. He murdered his girlfriend. He disposed of her body in Taiwan. It was not really, I mean, it was kind of covered by tabloids and it was covered, you know, certainly in Hong Kong, but this was not international news. You know, the complication came because of the geopolitics of the situation between Taiwan, between Hong Kong, between the mainland, that he came back to Hong Kong. He was arrested for using his girlfriend's credit cards to remove money from her bank account. He confessed to killing her, and then there was really the legal mechanism to send him back to Taiwan to face punishment was very unclear as to how they could do that. I think that in you know, somewhere along the way, it became clear to politicians in Hong Kong and to Carrie Lam that this was presented an opportunity to kind of right what they saw was a wrong with this extradition agreements to mainland China, right? I think there was a little bit of opportunism on their part. I think they saw this as a way to kind of score points, you know, with the mainland officials and say, look, you know, and some of them had said it is odd that you can't, you know, their extraditions don't go to the mainland, but you can extradite people from Hong Kong to other places. Why can't they go back to be brought back to China? So they should have packaged this legislation really using this young woman's family as kind of an emotional ploy, really. They brought her out to press conferences. You know, she was obviously she remains like very anguished by the situation. And so that was kind of, you know, they kind of tried to wrap it in this emotion. And I think they thought that her story was kind of powerful enough that the Hong Kong public would be broadly supportive of the law. I think there's people who are tremendously, you know, who feel awful for her, but they also saw this law and thought this is like a Trojan horse, right? This is a way to essentially erode the wall between mainland and Hong Kong, especially in the legal system, which is something that is very, very, you know, the people in Hong Kong are very, very proud of, right? It's like a common law tradition. It's left over from the British. It is a totally different legal system from what happens in the mainland. And so when she put this bill forward, there was immediately, I think, distrust amongst people who are watching closely, you know, the kind of traditional activists, but there wasn't a huge amount of alarm immediately. I think that after 2014, the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong had kind of, you know, died down quite a bit. I think people were kind of at a loss of where it goes next, of what to do. There's a bit of a lack of energy there. A lot of stuff, had kind of faded a little bit. And so some groups, I think, that no longer exist, took it about themselves to kind of raise a lot of public awareness about what was happening. And then we saw the protests kind of start to build. Like in April, there was ones that actually were very large by if they were happening in, say downtown, DC or New York City, they would definitely get a lot of coverage because the numbers were big, right? It started off like 30,000, then 100,000, then 200,000. But Hong Kong did have this history of protests where those largely kind of like, even international media didn't really cover them that much. Then we get to July or June rather, sorry. And the numbers just got massive, too big to ignore, right? So I think us, as journalists, we were watching the situation, and I know I was kind of freelancing at the time, and I was telling editors like this is growing really big, and they were kind of like, it's Hong Kong, there's always protests, and plus the bill's going to pass, right? Pro-Beijing legislators, they have control of LegCo, they always have control of LegCo. It's kind of set up so they always will. So it's kind of a foregone conclusion, like why don't you write about it once it passes? And then the big protest started. The government just continuously, mishandled and misread the situation. I think at every turn, there were so many off-ramps. I think that's kind of the frustrating thing when we look at this now, that there were so many opportunities for the government to say, we could solve this another way. This is one way to calm it down. And they just kept Carrie Lam in particular, kept just plowing forward against all advice, not just from pro-democracy people, but from the pro-Beijing lawmakers, from her, outside counsels, from pro-Beijing stalwarts who have been in the system for a long time. We're telling her, like, really, you don't need to do this diplomatic community. And so, I think she was this force behind this thing that just ended up really upending Hong Kong and U.S. policy and all these things that we didn't see at the time.
So how did Beijing react to all of this, and how did they view Carrie Lam as a leader or as a compatriot?
Yeah, I think one thing that we really wanted to kind of like get right, because at the time it was so muddled, was like whose idea really was this bill, and like what was the force behind it. And I think all our reporting really from like every single source we spoke to said it really was Carrie Lam. And actually in the beginning, she was the one convincing Beijing that she could do it. She was the one telling Beijing, like, don't worry, I got this. And then obviously she didn't have it. And everything started, unraveling so quickly. And obviously this was the Trump administration, right? So it was at that point of unraveling, right, when all these like big, protests were on TV screens all over America and all over the world, really, that I think Washington really woke up and was like, okay, interesting, like this is happening in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong turned from an issue that was sort of fringe, I think, to the broader China conversation into something that was really, really key to the China conversation. And in that time, that's when you saw sort of a lot of enthusiasm on the Hill for the Hong Kong cause, right? You saw Ted Cruz appear, Josh Hawley appear. Republicans were certainly sort of the most kind of like dramatic about their support and actually like came to the city. But, obviously you have sort of, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and others who were longtime China supporters also, throw their weight behind the Hong Kong cause, right? It was really a bipartisan issue. And I think that was the point where Beijing started seeing, okay, firstly, the Hong Kong government is totally incompetent and we can't trust them anymore and we need to step in a big way, but also became convinced that this was an American plot. And I think, what we were really like kind of fascinated by, and we did actually get a lot of access to pro-Beijing figures in the reporting of this book, was that they, told us, and I think quite truthfully, that like Beijing was really convinced that this was a plot to overthrow the CCP via Hong Kong. They couldn't see it in any other way, right? Especially when American flags started appearing on Hong Kong streets and stuff. When you saw that happening, they couldn't like view this in any other terms.
Yeah, and I think also, Beijing got put in this position because of the Hong Kong government, right? Hong Kong government pushed this through, and then they have to come kind of behind them and back them up. Because if they do, if you think about it, if they, the argument on the protesters and by everybody was that the legal system in China is opaque, it's politically driven, you'll disappear, you'll be held without trial. And so if they did come out and say, all right, we'll, this bill is, we'll take it all away and everything. It's an admission, sort of. I think the protesters sort of seen that as them kind of saying, oh, you agree with us, right? You know that your legal system is not, up to the same standard as Hong Kong, right? I think that the Hong Kong government, Carrie Lam in particular, the lawmakers, some of the most kind of forceful ones, put Beijing in a position where they kind of had to come behind and back this thing at some point, and then obviously it snowballed.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most frustrating things reading your book is that you see the off-ramps. I mean, I think even her husband said something to her at one point.
Yeah.
And you're like, you can save face at some point, gain, the happiness of the people and probably also the trust of Beijing, just stop this. But
right.
On she went. But, picking up on your thread in seeing the, American black hand in this, or the invisible hand, in an American plot. You talk about how one of the U.S. consulate officials, whose name I won't mention, but it's in the book, who got doxxed, who got followed, and was seen as like one of the bigger conspirators in this. I mean, they really harassed, the pro-Beijing folks really harassed U.S. officials on this. Were there other embassies that were targeted too, or other consulates, or this was just an American plot?
No, I mean, it really was so fixated on the U.S., right? And I think that was because it was the Trump administration, and it was an administration that, came out there and said China's our number one focus, right? And I think that that incident sort of really shocked the diplomatic community more broadly because, Hong Kong is not really a place where these things happen, right? Hong Kong is one of the most predictable diplomatic postings there is, right? It's not like Yangon, it's you don't go there expecting, this sort of thing to happen, right? And, the really interesting thing about that was the diplomatic community really rallied behind the US, right? Because more broadly, not even sort of Five Eyes, not even, they were like, this is total violation of like how you're meant to treat, diplomats under any international law, any convention. And so many tried to kind of speak up for the US consulate and speak up for them. And, just in true kind of like Hong Kong form, it was impossible to know who was driving this, right? Mm-hmm. Was it the Hong Kong government? Was it Carrie Lam? Was it the police? Was it the liaison office? Was it, MOFA in China? And I think that's like the real like sort of, if you want to bring this back to today and sort of navigating Hong Kong now post-national security law, post-crackdown, it's like who's really controlling all of this, right? In 2019, that was unclear when it came to sort of harassment and pushback, and it's equally unclear today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think there was also, because this movement really caught them off guard, the Hong Kong government and officials in Beijing. I think officials in Beijing were getting probably bad information. That's why you saw a lot of the liaison or the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office people, liaison office people were swapped out, right? There was a cleaning of house at one point after the protests could really get huge. It really caught them off guard, and I think you can kind of see, and looking back now, them searching for a narrative. And in the beginning, it was economic inequality. It was that the houses are really small in Hong Kong, that people can't afford flats, that they've been grown kind of jealous of seeing the rise of China. That didn't really stick for that long. That was kind of you could see that kind of come out in Chinese state media and talking points for a while, and then you could see this turn where they kind of settled on the U.S. And also the UK as well, is that they never left, that they have always been trying to recolonize Hong Kong, that they'd always been working behind the scenes to destabilize it. So I think they went through a few kind of like iterations of trying to explain this before that one was settled on.
Yeah, it's interesting in the way that that the Chinese have also tried to wrap their heads around the Taiwan problem as well, and how their misinformation, disinformation campaigns don't tend to land. And I think it's part of the misunderstanding of what a democracy is and why people enjoy it. And yeah, it's super messy. It gets terrible results sometimes, and it's a messy lead up to get what you want, but ultimately people want choices and freedoms, as Josh Hawley seemed to want for Hong Kong. It's nice if you wanted that for
and I think there was also perhaps this misnomer that if Hong Kong people were given the opportunity, as they have been promised to elect their leader, all the past kind of polling and academic research and journalism would point to the fact that they would not elect a long hair radical or a person like that. They would probably elect someone who is, of the kind of maybe light blue, pro-Beijing, Jasper Chung type moderate, right? I mean, so that's the other thing. I think there's this idea that if Hong Kong was given the choice to choose, they would be picking this, radical kind of separatist or Edward Long type. And frankly, those people did not have huge appeal. I think, if it were down to a vote, you would see someone get elected who would probably be a fairly kind of moderate character.
Yeah, and people were just radicalized by 2019, actually, right? They were not. They didn't feel the way they felt until all these things happened, and especially when the trust in the police collapsed, right? I mean, I think to us that was like one of the most important things to kind of like get across. That it was only when all these like institutional trust, right? Trust in the CE's office and Carrie, trust in the police totally collapsed. Then were people starting to say, wow, maybe we can reimagine a world where we have more autonomy or even start uttering the word independence. It wasn't even like this was like fueling it or this was driving it or this radicalization started off, being the sort of ethos of the protest movement. It was only by the end where people felt so desperate and so kind of hopeless, right, that this radicalization happened, which I think is an important lesson, globally, right? Radicalization happens when people feel they have no other choice.
Right, when you take away their future. So perhaps one of the best things that happened to LegCo and the chief executive is COVID.
Yeah.
So what happened to the protesters and where is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was so obvious that this gave them like a great amount of new control mechanisms, right? They were passing, laws on group gatherings, things were happening all over the world. But in Hong Kong, as in other places, but particularly in Hong Kong, it was so obvious that these were being used to stop people from gathering who were pro-democracy protesters or provincial activists. I mean, it really gave a new measure of control to the government. So I think that was it. I think people in Hong Kong were also, having lived through SARS, were very cautious themselves, right? I mean, so I think they were also very, when you there's very vivid memories of SARS in Hong Kong and how horrific that was, right? So I think that, there was a dampening because people were afraid. But then on top of that, the government really kind of went out of their way to make sure that you couldn't gather, that you couldn't, the candlelight vigil in Victoria Park for Tiananmen, all of those controls. And, sure, early on, some of it kind of made sense knowing, the information or lack of information at the time. By the end, it was, you had, very esteemed medical professionals at HKU coming out and saying, like, this is clearly, a political thing.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it really, I think we wonder often and talk about this, if COVID didn't happen, I think the protests probably would have carried on in some capacity, at least for a while. The national security law is a big and like kind of very frightening tool, and I think that they were getting ready to use that, but COVID certainly kind of expedited a lot of the kind of halting of what was happening.
So you're both in DC. So we're going to turn our focus here for the next couple questions, but you did mention the Trump administration, the actions they took, as well as Senators Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz were involved, Hollywood's involved as well. There was the 2019 Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which was dusted off from 2014. That was brought up during the Umbrella Movement. And just recently, a couple of weeks ago, Congress has introduced a Hong Kong Sanctions Act. So it doesn't look like Hong Kong is totally dropped from the radar for the United States, but how effective has the U.S. been on Hong Kong? Do you think, where does this fall in its priorities, and is this having any effect?
So, as mentioned, like in 2019, we really had this sense, we were both in Myanmar, so we saw that sort of like rush and enthusiasm from Washington when Myanmar opened. what we saw in Hong Kong even greatly surpassed that, right? I mean, it really was like everybody wanted to have a piece of this pie, right? Everybody wanted to weigh in. Everybody wanted to like share their 2 cents worth of how Hong Kong policy could go. And again, you know, with the experience of Myanmar at the, you know, sort of back of our kind of reporting belt, you know, when sanctions were first sort of floated, we were like, this will take years, this will take ages, this doesn't happen so quickly. I mean, there's no way. And then, true enough, it happened stunningly quickly. And it happened with such speed that I think, you know, Hong Kongers were really like feeling like, wow, okay, the US has got our back. And that was like a very, very happy moment in the city at a time of like great despondence, because it came, I think, towards the end of the year where sort of the momentum on the streets was getting a little bit lost and not sure where to sort of go on from that. But, you know, I mean, if you have like 2 kind of like strategies when it comes to Washington, right? Obviously one is, you know, sanctions and punitive and punishment, and then the other is like helping, right? Or like pathways, you know, to residence, asylum, so on and so forth. And, you know, while a lot was done on the punishment side, the sad truth is like almost nothing was done on the other side, right? And I think, you know, till today, I think that remains like such a frustration of activists who are still in limbo, you know, who are still like kind of trying to find their footing here because no sort of immigration pathway was offered at all to them.
And then there's many of those activists that you talked about, including Gwent, that are in jail or have a 30-year sentence hanging over their head.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Shibani touched on it, it was just the speed of stuff at the beginning, I think gave people a lot, you know, Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, you know, you said it was revived, it got, you know, massive support. I think Massey probably was the only guy who voted against it, but then, you know, there was some wavering there of when, you know, Trump was going to sign it, if he was going to sign it, you know, that still, you know, happened very quickly. There was, before that, there was, I think, Hong Kong Protect Act, there about, you know, selling weapons and things to the Hong Kong police. There was, you know, a lot of this stuff happening, and I think that's what gave the movement and people on the street, and not just, I mean, we're focused on the U.S., but there was stuff happening, you know, in some other countries as well, that gave them kind of a lot of hope of what kind of like was possible, and then I think as Shibani touched on. You know, when things got really bad in the NSL and stuff, then I think a lot of people were looking again to the U.S. And unfortunately, this touches on like a super toxic and frankly broken system of immigration in the United States. And when you get into that argument, into the politics of that, is totally different from you know the politics of what they were dealing with before. Then, you know, you're really getting into something that there's really strong positions on that are not gonna waver, right? And so I think that was a really kind of harsh realization, especially because you know, the UK you know, opened up some pathways for people to come from the BNO passports. Canada made some changes. So yes, I think they saw that happening in other places, and we're kind of looking at the U.S. thinking like, you know, what's taking so long? Why hasn't it happened here? The Biden administration has also sort of done the bare minimum on that as well. They haven't made much progress at all. So yeah, and I think also, you know, some people in the United States will tell you, and you know, various people around DC, that it wasn't their problem. The UK has the baggage here.
Right.
You know, the UK did the right thing because they owe it to Hong Kong. You know, they're the ones who, they have more of a connection. They should be handling it. It shouldn't be us, right? I think that is definitely a feeling amongst some people. Understood.
So one other thing that the U.S. is going to have to deal with also on immigration is that, and his name was invoked before, but activist Joshua Wong and his asylum bid. What does the U.S. have to consider here, and how do you think they're going to consider his bid?
Yeah, well, so we reported in the book that, you know, right before the national security law passed, you know, Joshua Wong, like many other activists, were looking for an alternative to really the choice that faced every activist in Hong Kong, which is jail or exile, right? And Joshua was in a difficult position because he didn't have his passport because he'd been arrested so many times. And you know, one idea, one strategy, right, was to see if the U.S. would consider an asylum bid. And you know, the thing that basically we sort of reported out there was that request sort of reached sort of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and it was eventually denied. And you know, this actually wasn't something that was totally an unprecedented ask, right? I mean, after 1989, in the wake of the crackdown on Tiananmen, Fang Lichi entered the U.S. embassy in Beijing, was sheltered there until his exit was negotiated by Washington. And Chen Guangcheng, the blind lawyer, blind activist, in 2012, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton also negotiated his exit there. So, really the same protection that was granted to other high-profile, Chinese activists and dissidents was what, Joshua was hoping for there, and it was rejected. And I mean, I think, the thing there, as it was explained to us, at the heart of the issue was this calculation that China was too strong, right? And perhaps there was nothing to negotiate with them. And even if, there was Joshua and, that there was something that sort of could be traded there, they wouldn't actually engage or sort of compromise in any way. And to me, I think that was such a stunning admission, right? That this was the Trump administration. This was the Trump administration that claimed itself to be so radical, so brash, so hard on China, so like unprecedented in its approach, admitting they're too powerful and we have nothing to trade or offer. So like that was a pretty kind of stunning kind of revelation, because I think it spoke to sort of like the realpolitik and the limits of what they were trying to do here. If it was trade, fine, we push on that. If it was sanctioning a few people like Carrie Lam and whatever, we can do that. Like what's the big blowback on us? But when it comes to like the really, really tough choices, like in the end, we're gonna weigh on realpolitik as opposed to, principle.
And I think they were, we reported it in the book, and I think, people will make up their own mind whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision. I think there's people in the book who absolutely feel strongly one way or the other. I think they were running up against not only realpolitik, but like geography. I mean, Hong Kong is not, if you talk to, staunch pro-Beijing people, Hong Kong doesn't have a border. It only has a boundary, right, with China. And then it has a lot of water that also mostly belongs to China. So I think there was that real consideration. There was real logistical concerns and questions over like, is this even feasible? Again, I think we tried to kind of report it out in a way that shows, some people have responded to that part of the book and told us, well, in '89 and 2012, even it was a different era, it was a different China, and I think that's exactly what we're saying. It was a different era, it was a different China. There was different calculations.
And what's his status now?
Josh was in jail. They have stacked quite a number of sentences from kind of fairly minor things for taking part in protests and organizing them, and then so he's serving those. But then obviously the bigger case is his national security law case, which is he's one of 47 defendants in that case who were arrested and charged for taking part in a unofficial primary election. So essentially a public kind of gauging exercise of interest, and he was arrested along with 50 other people, and then 47 of them were charged. The case is ongoing. It's been dragging on for ages. It might be delayed again, according to the most recent reports. I think the Hong Kong court system is struggling with the just logistics of running these cases that the number of them and the number of defendants and people that they've brought.
So speaking of realpolitik, you touch on the NBA in your book. I don't want to open up a can of worms, Tim. You already look upset, but
No.
but you see this with people who come out and support something, whether it's celebrities, and then they go back and say, "No, I love China." But we saw this as well in the NBA, where people or players wear free Hong Kong or fans, and they get escorted out or whatnot, and that. There's been a back and forth, and this isn't just limited to China, but the NBA and Hollywood and others are really quite focused on, where the money comes from. So where does the NBA and others had played a role, and what are your thoughts on that in this book?
Yeah, so it was super interesting. I think that moment really broadened the interest in the Hong Kong protest movement. I think it presented it to a group of people. I don't want to pigeonhole sports fans as not caring about international relations, but I think it certainly broadened the interest and kind of at least awareness of what was happening. Now you had the Hong Kong protests all of a sudden were like leading Sports Center. They were getting reported about by ESPN magazine. It was a whole new kind of thing because, and the backstory obviously, Daryl Morey, NBA executive, retweeted or tweeted a statement of support in Hong Kong. He's since kind of come out and said that while he was studying at MIT, he knew a lot of Hong Kongers, and that he got interested kind of in the pro-democracy movement there. He's talked a little bit about since immediate kind of backlash to that from the Chinese government, canceling games and striking the deals off the NBA in China, kind of icing them out. And then it drew in players, most notably LeBron James, who was asked about this. So I think the first point I touched on, the broadening of this, was huge. I didn't think we really realized it until we came back to DC in 2019 for a short visit away from the protests, and just how many people were talking about the NBA aspect of it. It was like really big. And even in Hong Kong, it was certainly part of it, but there's also so much going on that it wasn't as big. I did go to a pro Daryl Morey protest at one point in support of him, where everybody wore NBA jerseys, and which is kind of funny. LeBron James got dragged into it, talked about it. I think, the frustration with people in Hong Kong was, and other people, not just there, was that this was also taking part at a time when the Black Lives Matter protests were kicking off, and people were really outspoken on that issue. And were really free to speak their mind. The Brooklyn Nets owner Joe Tsai, a guy who was, super pro BLM and about it, also a huge supporter of the national security law, and thought that the protests were awful and destroying Hong Kong, and that people shouldn't be doing what they were doing, right? So there's this just inherent, just kind of whiplash, I think, between the two things. And I think it's very hard for people. It was very angering and frustrating for people in Hong Kong to kind of square how you could be so, socially active on one issue, and then either disregard their issue or side with China on their issue. And I think what you said is sort of what it comes down to. It's just the economics of it. And really, it was for a lot of big corporations and the NBA and stuff are very afraid of getting on the wrong side of China because of the economic hit that they can take. And so that played out like, there was a very real, example of that.
So as we're wrapping up, say this is a movie, we do, the final scroll, or where are they now? So Hong Kong, where is it now? Do people treat it as business as usual? Forget about the protests. Where is Hong Kong now?
Yeah, I think one of the most kind of interesting things that we saw towards sort of the tail end of us working on this book, right, which was really like a 3-year project, was sort of a normalization of the situation and a desire, most notably on the UK's part, to re-engage with Hong Kong in a big way. I mean, the UK is the signatory to the Sino-British Declaration. They declared that breached, obviously changed their policy on letting Hong Kongers in, and then at some point in the past few months have really said that, we want to step back from megaphone diplomacy, we want to re-engage, and has been sort of sending sort of like cabinet secretaries and so on to, especially on the trade front, engage with Hong Kong again. On the US front, the most interesting thing has happened in the context of APEC, where John Lee, who's the current chief executive, was sanctioned in his role as police chief in 2019. Obviously cannot attend APEC because he is sanctioned, right? Under US law, you cannot do that. But, interestingly, the US government hasn't sort of come out specifically and strongly to say we did not invite John Lee. And so that has sort of been spun within Hong Kong as, oh, John Lee has a scheduling conflict, so he can't go. And, it is interesting to see both Washington and London sort of thread that needle, where they came out so strongly and so definitively in the wake of the national security law, but now either because of business pressure, economics, finance, whatever, or because the US has a broader goal, right, of re-engaging with China and Xi Jinping and having that Biden-Xi meeting, which is obviously coming up, being quieter in Hong Kong, right, and you see some of this sort of like kind of like very strong, very like definitive, approach and statement sort of being sort of walked back a little bit, even on sort of the sanctions front. So that's sort of been interesting to see. I know you mentioned the bill, the sanctions bill that's going, through Congress. It's I don't know. I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I'm not sure like how far that's going to go in this context now.
Or this Congress.
Exactly.
Right.
Compared to what we saw in 2019, right? And I know, Hong Kong activists have to work like 50 times as hard to kind of get this issue on the agenda with everything going on right now, which is pretty stunning, right? Because, really like Washington and those decisions taken in 2019 were what gave them hope and, fuel to keep going, right? It really did. And so for now, to see some of that momentum die as it has in the past few years, I think has been very disappointing to a lot of people.
So where's Carrie Lam now?
She pops up in the media occasionally at various kind of events around town. I think she was at an opera, photographed at an opera, and some other places. Beijing, I think they won't come out and say it, but they've made it pretty clear their dissatisfaction with her. She wasn't given any roles on the mainland. All the other, past chief executives, bar Donald Chung for his corruption issues, Tang Chihua, CY Leung have been given, positions on the mainland after they finished their term as chief executives as sort of a reward for service. They head kind of big think tanks or other organizations in this city, are very visible people. I mean, Tang Chihua not anymore. Obviously, he's in old age. He's not in very good health, reportedly. But CY Leung, certainly a very, very verbose and kind of out there figure in the public eye. Yeah, Carrie Lam not in that role at all. I don't think she's anywhere to be seen. There's reports, she got a very big office for her post-career life, which drew a lot of, again, anger in Hong Kong because taxpayers are footing the bill for that. But yeah, mostly vanished. She did one kind of interview with Chinese state media where she was kind of just like laying tons of praise on Xi Jinping and what he had done for Hong Kong and how he had stood with Hong Kong through social disruption. But other than that, yeah, mostly gone from the public eye.
And we touched on this a bit, but where are the protesters now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as mentioned, right, this like dichotomy between exile and jail was like a really, really clear one. The diaspora, I think, has taken up the mantle of, commemorating days that are very, very significant in the Hong Kong protest movement. But, within Hong Kong itself, the space has really, really shrunk to have any sort of, political view that is, in support of the pro-democracy movement. Really, what the national security law and then the kind of revival of the sedition law that has sort of come, at the back of that, and now we're sort of looking at potentially Article 23 being revived and passed quite quickly. They're all speech crimes, right? What they're criminalizing is speech. It's not, like action or like, throwing like a Molotov cocktail or whatever. It is saying something that is critical of the Hong Kong government, critical of the Chinese government, and so on, right? And so that has been, implemented so widely, right? I mean, there was a student who posted something in Japan who came back to Hong Kong and was arrested and faced, a prison sentence for what she posted in Japan. Stuff like that, I think, has really cast such a clear chilling effect over the city. And then you go into issues of academic freedom, freedom of the press, like really sort of like every institution, right, has been touched by this, and I think it's very, very hard to really see how resistance can carry on in the way it did before. I mean, there has been different forms of it. There have been different, soft resistance is what the Hong Kong government is calling it now. And I'm sure like people in their hearts still believe very, very much in the same principles that they came out and protested and stood for in 2019. But it is a very different city. It feels like it is a very different city.
And it was one of my favorite cities, and so that's very hard to hear. So I will conclude. One of the activists that you follow, Rev Chu, says at the end of your book, he says, quote, "We must constantly tell the next generation these things so they understand what happened." And I think your book, Among the Braves, is part of that literature and does help tell the next generation what has happened. So Shibani, Tim, thank you so much for helping tell that story and for joining me here today at CSIS. Thanks to everyone online for joining us. This will be available on our website and on YouTube. And so I guess virtually join me in thanking Shibani and Tim. And good luck with your book. Their book is available wherever you can buy books. And so please support the book. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much.